Thanks everyone for coming back. We're going to pick up the conversation after our discussion this morning about the clinical model. And I'm going to share what we're currently working on at the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, some of our research that's underway, and finish with some quick summaries of some previously or recently completed research, including some work on cashless gambling and some of our analysis of large data to give you a little bit of an indication of the type of work and projects that we have as outputs. So as I mentioned, I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney, and I'm director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the Brain and Mind Centre, as well as the Technology Addiction Team. So I have quite a few hats and quite a few roles, but essentially I'm looking after overseeing the clinical services and bringing that together with the research that's primarily aimed at reducing gambling harms. There we go. So this is a really unique setup. We're the only university-based gambling treatment clinic in Australia and one of the very few in the world. So it provides us with a tremendous opportunity to really learn from the clinical underpinnings from our direct work in the community with clients and that research knowledge. And so we have a lot of connections, and that is a really useful way of reinforcing PsychAware, where the research and treatment are building on each other with the plan to influence the broader policy and practice agenda. So just in brief, the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic was established in 1999. So we have a long history of working with individuals experiencing gambling harm. We're currently a GambleAware provider funded by the Office of Responsible Gambling, the New South Wales government. And we're responsible for 3 local health districts across the broader Sydney region, where we do have quite a diverse community. And we have around 20 locations. We also work with other partner organisations providing these services, in addition to the in-person, online and telephone treatment we provide, which is both individual and group. We do a lot of outreach with dedicated community engagement officers who go into the communities, who work with dedicated populations to provide specialised services. And really we're intending to learn from the communities as much as working out how to provide tailored and support services. So it's not just us going out, sharing our clinical model, but learning as much as possible how to best work with the communities and how to provide services that are going to be the most meaningful. So this week being GambleAware Week, all of our clinicians and community engagement officers are out in the field at various organisations, which might differ from an in-house event for professional development for staff to being at community stalls, sharing messaging with the broader community, to everything in between. So what I want to talk to you about is just the basics of underpinning why I'm at the point of leading this research, because we do thankfully have gotten to the recognition of the importance of an evidence-based safer gambling policy. Now, that has surprisingly not actually been the case for the entire time I have been working in gambling. It's been increased recognition of needing to derive evidence and research, particularly independent and credible research, as opposed to sitting around and deciding what sounds like a good idea. However, the critical factor in this is that there are a lot of policy questions that are being considered, demonstrated previously about a question of how long should a delay be? How fast should the spins on a gaming machine be? We don't actually have evidence to inform a lot of the policies that we're currently considering because they haven't been sufficiently researched. There's a big problem with putting things in place that are not evidence-based, but it's understandable. When we don't have evidence, we do have to put things in place. The bigger problem is when they're not evaluated. So when policies go in place that sound like they might work, great, but we have to actually test that's the case, as opposed to just leaving that in the legislation and hoping that that's the case and not actually considering it further. They might actually be counter-effective. And there are some examples of this with things like people hiding their gambling. So where we have policies, for example, that allow people to enter gambling venues through separate entrances, this allows people to hide their gambling. When we have a policy that to get rid of VIP signs, which recently happened in New South Wales, I don't know who makes signs in New South Wales, but they are very happy about this policy because every single gambling venue has a brand new, larger than ever sign that says probably nothing about VIP, but they don't have to because they've just got shiny lights, which everyone knows mean that they're poker machines inside. So I've actually seen signs that just have blinking lights with no content. Things like blocking natural light. This is a you know, something where we're hiding gambling from public view. So if you go past a gambling venue, you're not allowed to see poker machines. But this has the result of meaning all poker venues or all gaming rooms are completely enclosed, you know, the best case, dark tinted curtains. Most case, they're completely blocked off in a dark room. So no natural light can come in, making it difficult for people to understand the passage of time and know what time or day it is. We've got displaying the harmful consequences. You know, when I was working in gambling venues, or posters on the wall of little sad kids crying into bowls of cereal, which makes everyone really disconnect from the idea of having any gambling harms because they're not as bad as whoever that kid's parents are. And it really stigmatizes. You don't want to put your hand up and ask for help if you're going to be understood to be someone who would neglect and abandon your children. So it increases stigma and disconnect from help seeking. These are just some of the examples of counter-effective policies. So we want to look at how we can use treatment in our clinical and direct engagement to inform the research understandings, to work in with policymakers. And again, these arrows all go each way because we also want to conduct research that's going to inform policy. So we want to see, you know, what's coming down the line. Where are we going to need policies in, you know, 1 or 2 years' time that we can start doing research now, and then combine that with outreach and engagement, which includes learning from industry. So learning, you know, what are the technologies that the industry is starting to use? What are the trends that we are eventually going to see? Because those trends will impact the consumers who will eventually come into the treatment clinic, but we want to start research and engagement to understand those now. So we really need to work across stakeholders in an independent way. These are just some of the examples of the way research can inform policy and practice. You know, we've already had an example today. You know, how long is the break in between gambling machines? What constitutes a meaningful break in play? This is something that's been recommended and has been implemented in casinos in Australia, is there should be a break in play. How long is that? What do you do in that time? It's something that's relevant to cashless gambling as well. The idea that you should take a break from gambling, you have to leave the gambling floor. But what does it really mean to take a break in play in terms of reducing harm? Looking at innovative ideas, so looking at new technology. If we're going to move to account-based gambling or venues that have loyalty programs or some kind of player tracking, how can we use potentially these as a tool to engage with the audience and encourage embracing safer gambling? So there are a lot of unknown questions. Again, I really think, and I've been speaking at a lot of events my whole career. I've spoken and been at events where I haven't been comfortable. I've shared an example just at morning tea of people talking about how can we enhance safer gambling, which sounds like a really great idea, while maximizing profits, to which I sort of say, yes, that would be very difficult. That's not the point of maximizing profits. We're talking about sustainable gambling. Keeping an industry going doesn't mean bleeding your customers dry. It's about how do we get customers that are going to have be able to sustain their gambling over a longer history. But it's important for me to hear the objections from people who disagree with what I have to say or have a different agenda, because this is the world that we all need to work in to institute change. So I think it's important to be part of those conversations. And I really appreciate everyone listening today and I would like to hear from you and your own perspectives as well. So as I mentioned, our goals are really to engage with all relevant stakeholders and community members. I've mentioned a few ways where research can support industry and regulators in terms of informing best practice and guiding refinements. But it's also really important that the other stakeholders consider themselves in what they can contribute to the research process. So we need to access to relevant data. You know, we need to know what is going on. We also need, because gambling is such a highly regulated area, we need to work with industry and government to be able to trial intervention. So if we're going to put something new in place, we need to work with the industry to do a trial. We can't do that in a lab and tell someone, just pretend you're gambling for real money. That doesn't work very well. It's been tried lots of time. So we need funding mechanisms that are independent. We need access to customers, and we need to also engage to identify priorities. The worst thing that can happen is we do a bunch of research that doesn't go anywhere because it's not relevant to the policies that are putting in place. It's a waste of effort. However, in saying that, we also need to do this very much in the independent manner. So research must be independent from other sources, which includes independence from the funding body, whether that be industry or government, because both of those bodies have a conflict of interest. They both rely on, or will heavily rely on money from the gambling consumer. So we need to have mechanisms in place. And fortunately, research has evolved, and now we have lots of ways to look at integrity within research, obviously having ethics approval, but also having things like open science practices, which mean we publish the research before it's actually conducted. We publish the protocols, the analysis plans, so that no one can accuse the researchers of changing the research after the data is collected, because we've already said what we're going to do with it. And obviously publication without restrictions, so no embargoes, and then having steering committees, which I'll talk about a little bit later in explaining what we do at the clinic. We've already, I'm sure you're all aware of the problematic gambling, so I won't go into it in detail because you're all experts here today. What I do want to highlight is to move away from this figure of 1%. You know, the idea that only 1% of Australians have gambling problems. That is true. However, most people, not everyone in Australia gambles, and certainly most people in Australia don't gamble regularly. So it's a fairly misleading statistic. If we look at, this is the Hilda data from a pretty representative, or as representative as we can get, national prevalence study, we can see that around 22% of regular poker machine customers, so these are people who gamble monthly, and over a third of wagering customers experience some level of problems. And if you extrapolate that out against the individuals harmed in association for each individual, we can see that the proportion of people being harmed by gambling is a lot broader in the community, which again speaks to why this is an important public health issue. And we really need to get away from that idea that there's only a minority of people harmed, because it's really not true. That one. There has been a lot of focus on this pointy end of the continuum. So looking at that small proportion of people in the population who end up experiencing harm and relying on them at some point to put their hand up to self-exclude from a gambling venue or get treatment. We're pretty good at that. Even then, we're not perfect. Self-exclusion is by far the most effective mechanism. Treatment is good, but again, we're relying on people to put their hand up or finally say, I've got a severe gambling problem, as opposed to doing something like putting up a fence at the top of the cliff to stop people from experiencing exacerbation of harms, which trickles out not only to their immediate family, but to their workplace, their friends, and the community around them. So really want to move towards preventing gambling harms. And that's my background. I started off, you know, when I was doing my undergraduate degree in psychology, working in gambling venues and seeing people put, you know, I was making $14 an hour, slinging beers down in the rocks, watching people put hundreds of dollars into the poker machines and putting 50 after 50 on dog races in the tab. And to me, that just didn't make any sense. I know through my psychology degree of what happens if that continues, why, you know, what is that irrational behavior, and why isn't there a focus on prevention of harm, which, particularly given the ripple of costs associated with someone who finally has a fully developed gambling problem, it's far more cost effective from a societal point of view, and obviously from a harm minimization, which has, you know, harms that are so interpersonal we can't put a price on them. So that's what I've been focusing on. So this idea of early intervention, those at risk, the prevention, you know, are those public strategies, the signs on the buses, you know, public-wide communities. I really want to talk today about the early intervention, the people who are regularly gambling, who are at risk of exacerbating their harms and going from a regular gambler to a more involved, serious gambler. Not discounting the people at the far end, but this is the focus of where I'm at the moment. And that includes thinking about this from a stepped care. So stepped care is this idea that we need to have specific intensity services to meet the right population. So yes, we have treatment and we provide that regularly. However, not everyone wants to engage in 6 to 12 sessions of in-person treatment. And for many people, that's not really appropriate. We want to look at, are there lower intensity services? And this is something I don't think we have very well developed. If you put your hand up and say, I'm starting to feel unwell because of the gambling, or however you want to talk about it and phrase it, which we don't have great language around even, we need to have something other than just, okay, self-exclude. We need to start working on what do we have for people in the venue online who want to keep themselves gambling in a healthy, sustainable manner. How are we going to, as we mentioned, are there guidelines? Are there ways? We've got these for alcohol now. We've got sort of guidelines, you know, to drink 1 or 2 drinks an hour, you know, not to drive. These are ways you can still engage in alcohol, even at sort of higher than recommended levels while minimizing the harm that you are occurring for yourself and the community. We really have nothing for gambling. We've just got gamble responsibly and then self-exclude if that gets too much. So we need to really think about how can we have lower intensity services that are tailored for specific populations. So, young people are going to want a different type of intervention than someone who's 60 years old. So I'm briefly going to break down what that means for lower risk gambling behaviour. And this is a screenshot from the Canadian lower risk gambling guidelines, which have also been developed for Australian specific statistics. And essentially they've worked out based on multiple longitudinal surveys across about 15 different countries, that for people, if you don't want to experience harms, these are appropriate guidelines. So you should spend less than 1% of your household income before tax on gambling. You should gamble no more than 4 days per month, and you should only gamble regularly on 2 different types of games. Now, if you keep to these levels, you're very unlikely to experience harm. It doesn't mean that if you exceed these levels, you are going to have gambling problems. It just is that if you want to be sure you're going to not experience harms, this is a lower level that's recommended. So we're at least starting to put the goalposts in place. Similar to drinking again, the idea that 5 drinks or more is unhealthy in a day doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you know what you're doing. If you want to go drink 10 drinks, fine. Just be aware that there's risks associated with that behavior. This is a similar sort of concept. So we need to think about how best to use these in the community to engage with people. We also want to think about the language. We have moved away from responsible gambling, which I think is great. That was a very, this idea of just a thought terminating cliche. It doesn't mean anything. It sort of stopped. Where do you go from there? But we need to think about, what does this actually mean? So when I talk about lower risk or sustainable gambling, I'm talking about setting and sticking to a budget, which is quite a complicated behavior in and of itself. Have you set a budget? What is it? What's an appropriate amount? Is it per day, per week, per month? Do you give people lots of options? That gets too complicated. Seeking relevant information is really critical. As we've already heard this morning, most people don't understand how the games they're playing works. I don't know they need an advanced degree in mathematics. They do need to know they're going to lose. That's pretty fundamental, and a lot of people actually don't know that. So we're talking about a pretty wide gap in terms of what we need to teach people. We need to teach people then, these are just general behaviours. So self-check-ins, how are you doing today? It's kind of what I say, don't shop at the grocery store when you're hungry. That idea of being aware of your triggers. How is your gambling going to go if it's, after 10 on a Friday night? Is that a good time for you to be gambling right now? Stopping at appropriate times and setting that for yourself, knowing when to walk away. Having a loss limit is more useful than having the amount you want to win. And being aware of the influences. If your mates like to egg you on, maybe, don't, or whatever it is. If you know that you're going to having a drinking night, maybe don't gamble at the same time. So some of these are pretty practical behaviors, arguably, for a lot of the decision-making in our lives. But given and people do say, what is it about gambling that's specific? Well, gambling, you can spend a lot of money in a short period of time. We know, however, that few customers voluntarily use harm minimization tools. So there are deposit limits on place. Online wagering is usually better because it's a technology-based platform with an account, so people can actually keep sort of a track. They still don't. They don't understand the aims. It doesn't really help that a lot of the tools to help people to manage their play are hidden under help menus, or do you have a problem, or do you need assistance? It's not really setting people up to be keen to click on those or to see those as relevant for them. And we see this, we don't see people using the tools because they say it's not for me. We have to think about it. We tell people set a deposit limit and it's just a box, and then what is that? What's an appropriate, how easy is it? How many people here have a budget and know exactly how much discretionary income they have, let alone how much they should be spending on coffees a week, let alone something that has much more of a scale of discrepancy like gambling. Where are the tools positioned? What are the cultural norms around this? Are other people using them? Is there any, public messaging? It's all quite hidden. Are the tools meeting the customer's needs? So this is an example here. This is from Gambling Help Online. Again, it has lots of tools about understanding your gambling, thinking about your gambling, and it's called Help Online. But it helps you work out a calculator that forward projects. So you say, I want to spend $100 a week on gambling. They just say, great, no problem, very non-judgmental. Just so you know, that's $5,200 a year, you know, $434 a month. Just checking that's okay with you. This is the proportion of your income that's been spent on gambling. You can do this sort of feedback in a very non-judgmental, factual way, but just to help people to think through and understand the consequences of their decisions. And I use the behavioral design framework. I do a lot of collaboration with people in across different faculties, in economics, in business, in user design, in psychiatry and public health, to think about how are we setting things up to make them easy. This is the nudge framework for those not familiar with behavioral design or behavioral economics, the idea that you take the candy away from the checkouts and fewer people are going to impulse buy candy on the way out. You're not restricting the choice. You can still buy candy in a supermarket, but you're helping people set them up onto success. You know, when you're on a gambling website, the withdraw money sign should be as large, if not larger, than the deposit money. And that should be easier to do. You know, these are the sorts of things that when a poker machine displays credits as opposed to money, and it goes into your credit meter or back onto a Tito ticket as opposed from cashing it out, if the machine automatically paid out large wins, people would be more likely to take that money away and walk away. So the way you set up a gambling product and a gambling environment, or even a gambling intervention, is going to have a huge impact on whether people engage with it or not. And I think there's a lot of work we could stand to do there. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we have going on. We've got plenty of time for questions and discussions. So we've got a program of research at the moment that has a few different aims. The first aim is to understand consumers. I think we've really missed the boat on this. A lot of the research that policy is being based on is decades old, you know, with 50-plus-year-old men only who only played poker machines that are a couple of decades old in a lab situation because at that stage industry weren't involved. So we've got outdated research informing a completely non-relevant problem. They're not looking at what's currently happening. So we need to go back to principles. We need to look at what are the risk markers in place. So we're using technology solutions. We're working with operators, both venue-based and online, to access complete customer records. So 12 months worth of all of your customers, we will have that data, please. And that is being provided to us. Then what we're doing is surveying the customers and matching their survey responses to the data. So we know that, you know, customer XYZ who gambles this frequently also has this level of income, is this age, has this self-declared gambling problem, and drinks this amount. So we're getting context to then understand, which we'll then use to extrapolate to learn about the customers who we don't have the data on. So we're using sophisticated analysis, we're using machine learning to essentially identify subgroups and be able to drill into the data to work out what does a risky gamble look like just based on the behavior alone. This isn't going to be able to identify all people who have a gambling problem, but it's going to help us to understand and identify and detect people over time, to feed that information back to them, to feed the information to venue operators with the duty of care to intervene, and not just at that problematic level, but much earlier on when problems start to become apparent. And also to identify people who are gambling in a lower risk way and potentially encourage that, you know, send them, you know, good work, here's a coffee voucher, you're gambling at a really appropriate level. So really looking at ways we can understand customers to inform interventions. The next thing I'm involved in is account-based gambling. So this is otherwise known as cashless gambling. I don't really like that term. It's not actually an accurate description. There's plenty of cash still being involved. But looking at a trial of a cashless gambling system that's currently in place in New South Wales. And we're also surveying venue customers to think about if this was optional for them, because currently cashless gambling is only available in a small number of venues and it's still in a trial and regulatory decision process. But to look at for venue-based customers, what do you think about this? If this were to become available, would you voluntarily use it? Why wouldn't you use it? Why would? So if it does become implemented, we can think about how to introduce it in a way that customers would engage with it in a meaningful way, particularly engaging in the voluntary harm minimization features like deposit limits and viewing activity statements. So they're the two pieces of work to understand consumers. We've also got other things going on to inform that. So understanding the interventions. And I've got some of my team members here today, if you're happy to stick around and meet with them. We're looking at co-designing lower risk gambling tools, and that's purposely vague. We don't know what these interventions are going to be because we don't want. We specifically are going a different approach to, rather than experts coming up with treatment, we are wanting to work with the individuals. We do have a good understanding of what interventions work, but what we know, and as Dr. Thornton's going to talk about in a few minutes, is customers don't use interventions. If you provide treatment services and apps at work and all these great resources, they are not used. And we all spend in the next decade trying to figure out how to get people to use all these beautiful resources that are available. So we're going back to basics. We're actually working and doing focus groups and surveys and interviews with consumers who regularly engage in gambling to work out what do they want? Where do they see the issues? If something was available in the venue, what would you want it to look like? And to the end of the day, whether this is, I want something to help with my finances, or I want to sleep better, or I need a reminder to pick my kids up from school, we don't really mind what it is. We want to know, what is the foot in the door? How can we get engagement? What is the problem that people are trying to solve? And if they are sleeping better, they probably will make better decisions about their gambling as well. So we're really looking at what do consumers want, and how can we build gambling help into that as opposed to the other way around. So we're really interested in this co-design mechanism. I don't think it's been done very well in gambling, specifically not in a New South Wales context. And the final thing we're doing is we're starting to, where we can, evaluate some of these government policies. So, for example, as part of the National Consumer Protection Framework for online wagering, there was mandated activity statements that are sent out monthly to everyone who has an active online account. We're going to look at whether that actually makes an impact or not. As far as I'm aware, the government aren't doing this themselves, so we're going to do it. So this is the structure in which this all occurs, because I know you're not all researchers, but there's a core team of people working on this. It's based in the Gambling Treatment Research Clinic. We're in the Brain and Mind Centre. We also work with people at the Life Course Centre, which is another university centre in the Matilda Centre. So we've got lots of collaborators. Importantly is we've got 2 advisory committees. So we have an expert advisory committee with people from outside the university who check in to make sure our research questions are appropriate, our methods are appropriate. They look for any risk, anything else we should be considering, and they'll help us with interpretation. And we also have a consumer advisory committee. So we've got people who regularly engage with the products, and they're working as well to make sure that our questions make sense, that the actual design, so they go through, for example, our survey and say, take out this academic mumbo jumbo, just say really brief questions and in consumer friendly language. And so that's a really helpful point for us to make sure that we're checking in and that there isn't any bias that we're not aware of. Because that's and the funding comes from partnerships. So we have direct funding from the gambling industry, and we have funding from the university, and we have funding from a US-based and other NGOs. So there are, collaborators there as well. I'm going to just briefly tell you about 2 projects that we've finished, just to give you an idea of the impact, but then we'll move on to some questions. So one is a project with my economics colleague. This was an honours students project where she looked at the gambling data we had and wanted to look at essentially what you would know as chasing losses, but essentially what happens to gambling behaviour as a result of what's previously happened. So we had a data set of 10,000 clients randomly selected by the operator from an online wagering operator, and then that was analysed in relation to some ABS data on socioeconomic disadvantage. There's a lot of really fancy graphics and slides and big number sets associated with this that I have taken out. So bear with me on that, but if you want to see the actual details, I can definitely share it with you. Essentially, we were looking at, is loss chasing greater amongst people who have fewer resources? Very simply put. So the outcomes were that we found that as a proportion of the population, that there were fewer people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds actually placing bets. And this does fit with early day research on internet gambling, that it is more common amongst people from higher socioeconomic status. There's obviously a technology divide there as well. This was obviously a few years ago as well. However, this is also in contradiction to land-based gambling. So land-based gambling does tend to be more concentrated amongst people from lower socioeconomic divide. So that does indicate some sort of splits between the demand and supply of gambling. Compared to people from higher socioeconomic groups, and this was based on postcode. So it's not necessarily, we didn't have income for these individuals, it was based on their postcode. So there's a bit of generalization going on there. But people who are lower socioeconomic status who do bet online, they placed more bets, they had worse net outcomes, so they lost more of the money that they bet. And generally, they had a stronger response to past outcomes. So this went in both ways. So if they won, they spent more money. If they lost, they spent more money, both in terms of how much they bet and how much they deposit. So we did find this impact that people who had lower resources were most strongly impacted by what had happened previously, which is a pretty important thing to understand, because we take these sort of chasing losses as a generalistic idea, but it does seem like there's some difference in terms of the context. And it does suggest that this idea of what you're looking back of and what you're considering to inform your future bets does differ between certain subgroups. And this is why this sort of research, looking at data, is really important, because you can get at that granular level that you really can't see with the human eye. We need machine learning and advanced statistical modeling to identify things that we don't really even know to look for. The next one I think might be of interest is a PhD that's recently been completed by Thomas Swanton, that was funded by a now non-existent program that funded research. So thank you for the New South Wales government. Please bring it back. Cashless gambling. So this started well before any of the current trials in place, and wanted to look essentially at what are consumers' preferences and what is the impact of cashless gambling. There's a couple of different studies. There's literature reviews, focus groups, the links here if you want to click on the paper that's published. This is the last study we conducted that I wanted to bring to your attention. It hasn't been published. I'm pretty sure this might be the first time that's been presented, but it is underway of publication. So essentially, there was a discrete choice experiment, which is a fancy way of saying that we had a lot of people who we asked, do you want to do option A or option B? And they did this repeatedly, and we varied at what option A and option B were, so that they weren't really aware of what we were comparing exactly, but we could analyze across all the data. So essentially, we broke down the different factors of the system. So we looked at how you could access your funds, whether it was one venue or multiple venues, whether they had spending limits, whether it was voluntary, whether it was linked to your loyalty system. So we asked a bunch of variation of what the system would look like, and then which one would you use, or would you rather just play cash and not use any system? So it was informed by the context of New South Wales, but it wasn't tied to any system in New South Wales. What we did find was that most consumers, and these were people who regularly played gaming machines, so there was the appropriate target audience, most people preferred a system that was smartphone-based, although they did want to have physical cards as well. They wanted consistency across gambling venues. They did want to have a card that worked at multiple venues. Interestingly, they wanted mandatory self-imposed spending limits. So people did say, if there's going to be a spending limit, I want it to be mandatory, but I want to set it. So they did see that value of having the spending limits in place, and they wanted to be rewarded. So they wanted loyalty points or some kind of incentive for both spending and using the harm reduction features. So it's an interesting experiment, because it shows the preferences amongst different subgroups. If you were going to introduce a system in a voluntary way, this is what people would want to use it. And if you don't do it like this, no one's going to use it, because the modelling suggested that even in the best case, most people wouldn't opt into a voluntary system. And we've seen this from Victoria and Nova Scotia, other jurisdictions where a non-mandatory, a voluntary cashless account-based system has been put in place, and there's lots of money spent on that, and there's lots of effort put into it. People simply don't use it. So it's a nice lesson to take away. Now, and that's sort of our key takeaways from the overall body of research, that it does need to have that behavioural design. So you need to make it easier to withdraw money than to deposit it. You need to have a complete account of activity, and it needs to be mandatory. So I want to finish there. I know that's been quite a lot of content. We do quite a lot here, so I've tried to distill it down, but pardon me for that. These slides will be available, and this recording will be available. I wanted to take any questions from the audience, or anyone who's online. Please pop a question into the chat. But thank you for that, and happy to hear any comments or questions. Sorry, no, I went pretty fast through all of that. Yes, that's good.
Have you looked at the interplay between alcohol use or other substance use and gambling, and and how maybe use on the same occasions might influence gambling behaviours, and therefore how interventions might need to be tailored or whatever.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's one of the reasons we are going back to that co-design to talk to people about how they actually engage, and that idea of importance of considering that, because otherwise you can say, well, we've got this intervention in venue, why is no one using it? It's like, well, there's alcohol in the venue, they're all drunk, or whatever it is. We need to understand that as well as at home. I haven't personally done that. There is research looking at it, again, completely outdated. Likely it is very jurisdiction dependent as well. So we can't just take something from, the US and apply it to Australia. I haven't seen much of that in New South Wales. In our in-venue and hopefully in our online survey, we're asking about that. So we've got those questions in the surveys for self-report, but it is a really important factor, which hopefully will come up in our conversations with consumers.
Sally, thanks for your presentation. I'm interested in the recommendations that are coming out of this, because it's an interesting mix of promoting a degree of autonomy in the individual gambler and, if you like, brother coming in and imposing mandatory limits and so forth. Do you see any difficulty with, I suppose, synthesizing those two approaches to gaming harm minimisation?
It's a really difficult area. And I suppose when people ask me why I'm in this area, I do come back to the fact it's a jigsaw. It's a challenge to work with a regulated industry that are trying to make money and who are legislated and allowed to do so. However, there are individuals who are experiencing harm in relation to that. So and there's also a population of people who very much do not want a nanny state to be told what to do. And that has come through every aspect of our research, is people don't want to be told what to do, which is why you have to have a mandatory system if you expect anyone to use it, because otherwise they won't. So I do think it's careful. And that's why I think so much of it is dependent on the implementation. If you chuck a system down on people and tell them they have to use it and that's too bad, you'll end up with horrible outcomes. You need to take consumers on the journey of understanding why this is beneficial. It should be called something around the idea of putting customers in charge. We need to reframe the conversation to explain that we're not imposing anything on you. We are providing you with a tool that you can use to manage your own play. And that idea of I think the behavioral economic term is paternalistic liberalism, that we're not stopping you, but we are very strongly nudging you in this direction, because what has happened in Australia is there's been no anchors, no guideposts, this idea of just a complete free-for-all. I think we need to reframe the debate by actually going a little bit further in the other direction, setting out very strong parameters. And you've seen this in smoking. If you want to smoke, fine, but good luck trying to find someone within 50 metres of any building in which you can do so. So it's that idea of setting up anchors and helping people to adjust, getting the new generation on board. These are combinations of factors that none of them in isolation are going to make a difference, but we're taking people on a journey of understanding that if you want to gamble, similar to driving, great, put your seatbelt on, have your airbags, make sure you're not going to harm anyone else or yourselves, and then let's go, oh, but there's speed limits. So it's just reframing that debate as opposed to telling people yes or no. But I think we need to take people along for the ride to understand that, rather than imposing systems in that nanny state and framing it as we're taking away freedom. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, but that information piece is not as well considered. First, we need to know what works, and then we need to really carefully consider how to best make it work.
Just going back to some of the comments, I think part of the problem sometimes is, like you've identified that people say, well, I don't have a problem, that's somebody else's problem. Have you given a consideration of putting this in the context of like a customer care approach, so that somebody, that's not where the problem gamblers go, that's where everybody goes, right? And we do it in a more of a stealth way. I'm just wondering if you've done research on that.
Yeah, and that's very much around this idea of using the co-design and going to say, what would people use? What do you want? Do you want a safe room? Do you want an app that helps with something else? Like, what is it that consumers are interested in that we can frame this as something? We're not going to say, how can we design a help-seeking app? And we're not even designing a help-seeking app, because these are consumers that regularly gamble. They might not have problems. They might have some level of harm. They might be at risk. And that risk is what we're trying to manage, is how can we keep you gambling in a sustainable way? And if you're gambling in a sustainable way, great. Tell us what you're doing and we'll try and get everyone else to do that. So we're really going back to principles. So, for example, for casinos, There's, you know, these amazing VIP rooms, allegedly, I haven't actually seen them, but, you know, I imagine them as these opulent, and again, if I haven't seen them, most of the venue people haven't seen them, but I imagine them as some sort of opulent place where you're getting free food and free drinks, and not just, you know, free instant coffee, but like proper food and beverage and in a really luxury surrounding, probably on a high floor with a great view. And you invite like your people who essentially spend most money there. That's who gets to go in. There's probably a simple metric. It's who's spending the most, they get to the VIP lounge. If someone has a gambling problem, they're carted off to somewhere in a small, nondescript, hidden location. The new Crown one is actually a bit more public, so that's better, well designed. The Star one, I'm pretty sure you go down around Rabbit Warren and like you end up some sort of Alice in Wonderland. I don't know it's as bad as a security office, but it's certainly a far cry from a place you want to be. So, you know, switching those around, probably you're not going to put your VIPs in the dungeon. I get that. But thinking about redesigning a space where you can go to, you know, learn about gambling or be informed. And obviously there's economics. You can't give everyone barista coffee, but to sort of rethink that mechanism of how, if you want to encourage people to engage with this, you need to think of doing that in a way that people actually want to do it. They want to be seen to do it, you know, whether they're selected because they're gambling at a sustainable level, like you've won the prize into the, you know, the luxury lounge, whatever it is. But really, I want to rethink how we're engaging, incentivizing the mechanics of players, because it's obviously designed at the moment to maximize revenue. We need to think, how can we switch that around?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was great. You mentioned that posters, like help posters or flyers in the venue, are like already causing disconnection and shame for the person, for any person to raise their hand and say, oh, we have a problem, we need help. Do you think that disconnection or shame is even far worse for people from different cultures, because that poster most likely will be in English, and then it's already causing shame and disconnection for a person who speaks English? Do you think that that's even worse for someone else?
Yeah, and there's two things there. One is I think that posters can be helpful. They just need to be designed appropriately. So New South Wales, for example, and some of the other states have done much better jobs recently in creating more inclusive posters to get people to think about gambling on a broader spectrum. And they have attempted to destigmatize and move away potentially too far. The New South Wales ones only have happy people in them. So I think we do need a spectrum, but they have tried to be really culturally inclusive. And I agree that it's not just the language. And in fact, you want to be careful just simply translating the language, because there's obviously cultural nuances. So that's where I think the co-design comes through, of working with people from different cultures to design specific campaigns, and potentially having a little more freedom for people to take the messages and resources and redesign them and rebadge them, and to be empowering and working more directly with communities to ensure that the help-seeking messages, or broader than that, the awareness messages and the lower risk gambling messages, because I think we want to move away from that focus just on help, but focus more on gambling in an aware and informed way.
And one more question in regards also to that. You were talking about research and like future plans. Do you think there's going to be any like new research, but more inclusive with CLD communities and people who speak different language than English?
Hopefully. Again, it's all about the funding. You know, in New South Wales, we don't have any direct funding mechanism for gambling research, which is quite problematic. So hopefully there'll be pathways for that, but I couldn't speak to where that's going to come from. So I might turn it over now to Dr. Thornton, who's going to share with us some of her background and really successful work that the Matilda Centre has been doing around addiction and substance use, particularly with young people.